Sometimes I wish I wasn't the first person in my family to go to college, and that I would have been content to just join my parents and cousins in the family bakery. Then the events of this story wouldn't have happened. I had an interview for a place at an art college. The college in question was my second choice, but I was still excited. It was my first interview, my first time driving outside my tiny hometown since getting my driver's license, and my sister Lucy and best friend Jamie were coming along for the ride. We'd been looking forward to the trip for weeks. It was a 9-hour drive, so we left early the day before the interview. We had booked a hotel near the college to stay overnight. The route was mostly on the interstate, so I expected to make good time. And we did, for the first 6 hours. Then the radio warned us an overturned truck was causing delays ahead. Lucy Googled it on her phone. "There's been an oil leak and it's gridlocked," she told us. "I hope everyone's okay," Jamie said from the backseat. Lucy said, "The truck driver was sent to the hospital with minor injuries. Luckily, no one else was hurt." I asked, "Does it say when things will get moving again?" She replied, "No, but the leak looks serious and they'll have to move the truck. It says major delays are to be expected and not to travel if possible." I groaned in frustration. I did not want to be tired for my interview. It had already been a long day of driving. I knew I'd be exhausted the next day if we arrived at our hotel late at night. I pulled over onto the shoulder and studied the sat-nav on my phone, searching for an alternative route. We were 20 minutes from the affected stretch of the road. I thought perhaps we could get around it and rejoin the interstate on the other side. I found a route. It was long-winded, and some of the roads looked pretty rural. I knew it would add at least an hour to our journey, but I figured it was better than sitting in traffic indefinitely, so I left the interstate at the next exit. At first it went smoothly, and we were in high spirits. Lucy was munching on pretzels, and Jamie was singing along to the radio, but as we ventured further into the countryside, I realized the road I planned to take was a footpath, not wide enough for a car. This hadn't been obvious on the map. I did a U-turn, hoping there was another way. I drove around but didn't find one. It was getting dark. The girls were silent, concern growing. "Let's just get back to the interstate," Jamie suggested. I put the interstate into the sat-nav, but it lost connection. My cheap car didn't have a built-in sat-nav. I was using my phone, which needed some kind of internet connection to plan a route. I tried to find my way back to the interstate without the sat-nav's help, but it was hopeless. I thought my phone would eventually pick up a connection, but it didn't. This made me certain we were headed in the wrong direction, but every time I turned around or tried a different road, we got more lost. It was soon pitch black, my headlights the only illumination in the wilderness. The others looked nervous. Lucy blurted, "We need to call 911. Jamie laughed. "Way to overreact," she chuckled. "We need to call someone," I said, planning to call my dad. But there was no signal, of course. My phone soon ran out of battery, so did Lucy's. Hers didn't have much to begin with, and the sat-nav had drained mine. Jamie's was still going, but she had no signal to call anyone. I noticed the car was getting low on fuel. I didn't tell the others because I didn't want to alarm them. My car was also struggling on the potholed roads, and I feared we'd get a puncture. Then we saw lights ahead. It was a building. Jamie whooped with joy. Lucy had tears in her eyes. I drove towards it, soon realizing it was a motel. It was nearly 10 p.m. We decided we'd have to stay here tonight and lose our money on the hotel we booked. I was exhausted, and it would be easier to find our way back to the interstate in daylight. There were 11 other vehicles in the car park. I was surprised a motel this far out back and beyond would have so many visitors. I hoped it wasn't some posh retreat we couldn't afford, otherwise we'd be sleeping in the car. I figured at least we'd found somewhere to ask directions. The motel turned out to be very reasonably priced. The decor in the office was strikingly old-fashioned. Jamie muttered something about Bates Motel. I cringed, hoping the elderly woman behind the front desk hadn't heard. She introduced herself as Mrs. Morris. She was keen to help and kindly gave me a bottle of fuel for my car, but she didn't seem to know what a sat-nav was when I explained our predicament. She also claimed there wasn't an interstate nearby. This panicked me. I worried with all the wrong turns we might be wildly off course. But Mrs. Morris looked to be in her 70s or 80s. I wondered if she was confused because you would expect a local motel owner to be aware of the interstate. The motel didn't offer rooms with enough beds for 3 people, so we took 2 rooms with Lucy and I sharing a bed and Jamie in her own room. There was an inside door connecting our rooms. This could be locked if the people in the next room were strangers, but we kept it unlocked for Jamie. We said goodnight and I hurried to get ready for bed as we planned to leave early the next day. I plugged my phone into charge and was about to turn out the lights when Jamie came running through the connecting door. She had a towel around her body and shampoo in her hair. "What's wrong?" she asked urgently. "I was in the shower." Confused, I asked what she was talking about. "You were hammering on my door screaming," she replied. I glanced at Lucy in confusion. I said, "Why would I knock when the door's unlocked?" "It was the outside door," Jamie replied. I could see her piecing it together. It couldn't have been me. I wouldn't have gone to the outside door when I could use the connecting door. "I was sure it was you," Jamie added. I glanced at Lucy again. It didn't make sense. Neither of us had left our room. With our room being adjacent to Jamie's, we would have heard if someone had been at her door, especially if they were screaming. I looked at Jamie expecting her to announce it was a joke, but she looked confused and borderline terrified. "It's probably nothing to worry about," I said, trying to reassure her. I wondered if this really was Bates Motel, but kept the thought to myself. "Double check the outside door is locked," I added. "Then whoever was out there can't get in." Lucy went to the bathroom, but before she closed the door, she ran back out shrieking. Jamie and I asked what was wrong in unison. "There was an old woman at the window." "Was it Mrs. Morris?" I asked. "She wasn't that old," Lucy replied before she and Jamie started getting hysterical. I went to the bathroom after calming them down. I feared if they kept screaming, Mrs. Morris would ask us to leave, and we had nowhere else to go. The only window was tiny and high up. Nobody was there now. I wasn't worried. There were bars on the outside to prevent entry, and most people wouldn't fit through such a small window anyway. There was no window in the bedroom. I thought this was a bit odd, but it didn't really matter. If anything, it made it harder for intruders to break in. I did my best to convince the others that nobody could get into our rooms, and we should go to bed. I was exhausted. "I'm really hungry," Lucy moaned. There was little I could do. There was no room service and we had no snacks left. I suggested we just get some sleep to pass the time until we could get food in the morning. My sleep was fitful because Lucy's tossing and turning kept waking me. At 5:30 a.m., she said she couldn't sleep and asked if we could get food. So I showered, hoping the breakfast hall would be open by the time I was done. It turned out there wasn't a breakfast hall, but Mrs. Morris drew us a map to the nearest diner. She said her friend Gus's omelets were sublime and to tell him she sent us. It took 20 minutes to drive to the diner. It was busier than I would have expected given the hour, but there were trucks outside, so I assumed most of the customers were delivery drivers. "That's odd," Lucy said, pointing to a display on the wall. There was a memorial for Gus, the original owner of the place. This confirmed my suspicion that Mrs. Morris wasn't all there. After enjoying a delicious cooked breakfast, omelets were not on the menu, we returned to the car, planning to check out of the motel and collect our belongings before going on our way. My interview was at noon. We would be cutting it fine. I'm sure you can understand my frustration when we got lost. It didn't make any sense. I was sure of the way back to the motel. We had Mrs. Morris's map and I had no issues on the way to the diner. There was an overgrown plot of grass where I expected the motel to be. I drove through the country lanes searching for the motel before somehow ending up back at the diner. I went in to ask for directions feeling deflated, knowing I'd almost certainly miss my interview. The waitress gave me a knowing smile when I asked how to get to the motel. "So, it happened to you too," she said. I looked at her in confusion, just wanting the directions. "This happens from time to time," she explained. "People see the old motel. One customer even swore he stayed there. He seemed perfectly sane. That was the weird part. The motel burned to the ground 30 years ago. There was a gas explosion. Luckily, the staff hadn't arrived yet, but the owner, Marjorie, and 15 guests died." "What was Marjorie's last name?" I asked, my voice and hands shaking. "Morris," an old man at the counter replied. "Lovely woman. The place burnt down 30 years ago today, in fact, around 6:45 a.m. Plans for the new section of the interstate were announced shortly after, so it was never rebuilt. The land wouldn't be good for anything commercial. Nobody ever drives through there unless they're lost. It's a funny old tale what happened to my brother-in-law. He survived that night after some crazy lady told him he'd die if he stayed. Saved his life, it did. He still feels guilty for not warning everyone else, but he didn't take the woman seriously. Only he couldn't sleep after running into her, so he packed up and left." I felt like the floor was going to drop out from under me. I gripped the counter for stability, my breath coming in gasps. The waitress guided me to a booth. "It's all right, honey," she said. "It's sad, but it was 30 years ago. They're at peace now." "You don't understand," I told her through heavy breaths. "Jamie's still inside." We drove back to the empty plot where the motel used to be, having confirmed with the waitress this was the right place. We shouldn't have gone to breakfast without Jamie. It was early and she was asleep. I didn't want to disturb her. Lucy was able to get a weak 3G connection on her phone. There had been none yesterday. I laughed, realizing 3G didn't exist 30 years ago. My laughter gave way to gut-wrenching sobs. Lucy held my hand as I cried. Internet searches confirmed what the people in the diner told us. The old motel was gone. I was desperate to know how Jamie died. Did she fade like a ghost, or did she experience the explosion? Did she die quickly, or was she trapped in the flames? Then something occurred to me. If the motel were to appear again, would Jamie still be alive? Could I get her out? I rented a small cottage nearby, but hardly spent any time there. I'd sit in my car entire days and nights waiting for the motel to appear. It never did, not even on the anniversary of the explosion. Lucy eventually persuaded me to move on with my life. I finally went to college, having deferred for 2 years. But I always returned to the site of the motel on the anniversary of the explosion, hoping against hope it would reappear. Last year, it did. I sprinted from my car to Jamie's room, banging on the door, screaming her name. Nobody answered. I remembered Jamie saying she was in the shower, so I ran around the back of the motel. I stood on a bin to call through what I thought was Jamie's bathroom window, but I must have miscalculated. It was our room. Lucy looked up at me and ran from the room shrieking. It was surreal seeing my sister 15 years younger than she is now. I called to Lucy, to Jamie, to myself, screaming until my throat was sore, but nobody heard me. I sensed the motel was somehow diminishing my voice. The suspicion was confirmed when I ran back to the front of the motel and tried to bang on the door of the room I shared with Lucy. A force pushed me away, like the door and myself were two magnets repelling. A man called out, asking if I was all right. I must have looked insane, trying to knock and being pushed away by an invisible force. "Leave," I screamed at him. "You'll die if you stay here." I wanted to smash a window, but the rooms had none. I remembered there was an axe in my car, so I sprinted to get it. I could use it to break Jamie's door down. No invisible force had stopped me reaching her door. Once Jamie was safely out, I'd tell Mrs. Morris to evacuate the motel. I realized I should have done this in the first place. She probably had master keys to all the rooms. I decided to abandon the axe idea and go to the front desk, but when I turned away from my car, the motel was gone. All the cars but my own, gone. The man, gone. I screamed, falling to my knees. I had one chance to save my best friend, and I'd failed her. Like I failed her by leaving her alone in the first place. The motel must have vanished when I had my back to it on the way to the car. When we arrived all those years ago, I guess at least one of us must have had it in our field of vision at all times. I wondered if something demonic was at work, but my husband thinks the motel is a ghost of the past or a glitch in time. He has a theory that it would be catastrophic for a future and past self to meet, so the universe does everything in its power to stop this from happening. He thinks that's why I was repelled from getting to my own room, but not Jamie or the man. There's so much I could have tried but didn't. Why didn't I leave a note on my past self's car? Why didn't I warn Mrs. Morris the moment the motel reappeared? I'm yet to get a chance to right these wrongs. The motel hasn't appeared again, but I can promise you this. If it shows itself again in my lifetime, I'm going to save my best friend.
Hi, I'm Justine. This is my first time doing any kind of voiceover, but I just wanted to hop on and say thank you for listening to the end, and a huge thank you to Mella for doing the narration. I've created a playlist of the other stories she narrated, so if you would like to check those out, the link is in the description. I'll see you in the next one.